Well, we were hoping for this to happen right before the Christmas holidays, because if we wouldn't have gotten a round of balance tuning right in the next few days, it would have meant going through all of the Christmas holidays plus New Year's without any changes, as the Blizzard crew was also going to go on a break, and we would have gone 2-3 weeks without any changes through this period in terms of balancing. So at the very least, this is what we are going to be getting next reset. On December the 19th, we have more balance tuning and more changes to many of the specs. We have to start immediately talking about the question of the day, which is the one related to mages. I've seen conflicting responses from this announcement from Blizzard. Mages do indeed seem like the main character of WoW, where they cannot contractually go at least one patch without receiving buffs and without becoming meta. Now, I understand one side of this argument, right? Because Mage is getting buffed. The majority of these changes are for more single target damage. Now, I understand the reaction of players, especially mages, defending these buffs. Because when you look at the rankings, for example, of Mage right now in the raid, well, you know, Mage is bottom half. If I asked you, hey guys, who do you think should be buffed before the next patch? You would be saying, well, you know, maybe Windwalker down at the bottom, maybe Red Paladin, perhaps Shadow Priest, right? But many of you looking at these results would also say mages. You know, it makes kind of sense to buff them, even if we switch from the overall damage to, for example, a pure single target boss like Volcaros. You can see the mages, all three of them are literally the three worst DPS specs, excluding Augmentation, who's broken on the logs and also is a support spec. And then you can say, for example, what about if it's a cleave fight like Council? Never mind. Mages are all towards the bottom half. What if it's a fight with a few adds spawning for some burst damage required? Nope, still bottom half. What if it's about a single target burst window of damage like the adds on Nimue? No, still at the bottom. What about if it's a fight with high movement? Maybe they are better than other casters on Smolderon because of it. Nope, still towards the very bottom. So, you know, technically it makes sense to want mages being buffed. However, at the same time as this is happening, what is also happening in the meta, it's not just the raid, because Mythic Plus exists as well. And what Mythic Plus is telling us is that the highest keys in the world are being done with mages. But what's worse, it's not even just with a mage, it's being done with different specs of mage. So both Frost and Fire are being used at the very high end of Mythic Plus. So you can go and take your Mythic Plus rankings, and you can see Mage being A-ish, you know, decent tier compared to the current situation in the raid, where they are far lower down. You can go on Sub-Creation and look at the raid, where Fire is very towards the bottom. You switch over to Mythic Plus, and now Fire is significantly stronger, together with Frost Mage, which then begs the question, why are they being buffed across the board for buffs that will also make them even stronger in Mythic Plus? The buffs right now, using napkin maths, are averaging about a 5% damage buff. About 6% for Fire, 4% for Frost, Arcane in the middle, around 5%. So it does beg the question, why? You know, why, even if you think they were weak in the raid, why did you also have to buff them for something that will make them even stronger in Mythic Plus, where they are already powerful? That is perhaps the question, the fear that players might have, that after this reset, the whispers of a new growing Exodia comp will start growing even more now that Frost, but especially Fire Mage, have gotten buffed even more and might become even more prevalent in Mythic Plus. That is the big question as to how the Mage specs were buffed. Even if you agree with these type of buffs, I believe you should have at least received some compensation nerfs to your AoE damage, for example, or even just to your utility in Mythic Plus, because right now this is a little bit too strong of a set of buffs for the mages playing Mythic Plus, more so than the raid. After that, let's move over to something a little bit less controversial, something a little bit more expected. We are talking about the nerfs to Demon Hunter, in particular to Havoc. You have Sigil of Flame, damage being reduced by 10%, which affects both specs, and then you have Havoc, where Collective Anguish, so the damage from the extra Fell Devastation, is reduced by 10%. Rage Fire, your stacking damage on top of Immolation Aura, now has the critical strikes reduced to 30% from 35%, and then a Fire Inside talent has a chance to reset Immolation Aura down from 30 to 25. These are minor, once more, nothing near the level of gutting, the level of nerfing required for them to not be anymore at this level of outperforming the other specs. So it's really just irrelevant. That's why I'm saying not really very controversial. Yes, they are nerfs. Yes, they are doing less damage. It's not even a 3% nerf, so it doesn't really matter for Havoc. This is not the kind of nerf you wanted to see if you didn't want to see Havoc meta as much as they are right now. What is perhaps a bit more curious are the set of buffs to the Evokers. I'm saying curious, I should probably say sad, because Devastation has 15% more damage done to Pyre, their AoE spamming spender, and on top of that 3% more damage done. Meanwhile, Preservation gets its 54th change to Resonating Sphere, now goes back to hitting 5 allies instead of 3. This was a terrible change, nobody liked it, everybody knew that this was not going to work. Blizzard was giving you more essences and more echoes through your tier, so they were like, well, you are generating more through your tier set, so to compensate we are nerfing this talent. It didn't work. That made no sense. You were effectively not buffing the spec whatsoever, because what you give them from the tier, which is supposed to be an extra, is now simply giving you something you lost because they nerfed you. So now you're going back to something that feels much better, especially in Mythic Plus, where you can now finally go back on hitting the entire party with Resonating Sphere. The other one is to Devastation, of course, their buff, particularly to their AoE damage. Now, here's the thing, Devastation right now, of course, shows up as being quite poor in terms of overall damage, regardless of the, the tier list that we try to look at. Devastation shows up in general as being quite low in the meters. So definitely getting buffed in terms of damage overall, or Pyre for AoE, is good. When I said sad, is the sadness that in the end they still have to compete with this thing right here. And this goes for both Devastation and Preservation. That is why I'm saying sad, because as long as that exists, it is near impossible for these two other specs to gain nearly as much relevance, especially in Mythic Plus. And also Pyre, AoE damage in the raid, it's not really that relevant for Devastation, and also the buff to Preservation is not even that relevant in the raid, because right now you're playing with the Blossom build, so you don't get too much of a use out of your Resonating Spheres, your Temporal Anomalies anyways. So those are technically good buffs, but with a hint of sadness because of the state of Augmentation Evoker right now in the meta. We then finally arrive to the buff of the week. The buff of the week is a buff to Windwalker Monk. As per the devs are saying, we continue to keep an eye out on Windwalker damage and feel they need a second incremental improvement. So the results are that a whole bunch of their abilities are getting a flat damage increase. This amounts to a 7 to even 12% damage increase, lower end of the buff for single target, higher end of the buff for AoE damage. Now it starts to get an actually meaningful type of buff, because this was already the overall damage of a Windwalker Monk in keys, right? If you increase this by about 10-ish%, they get to about 185,000, which would be actually right below BN. So they would be right below the top 4 of the OP specs in Mythic Plus. Even if you change a different type of setting, like using U.GG, Windwalker was at 177, you buff it by roughly 10%, they get to 193, 194, which once more beats almost every other spec below the OP ones. So these type of buffs are pretty good for Windwalker. Of course, the effect won't be nearly as strong in the raid, because your buff to single target is not nearly as strong, and you were weaker than you were in AoE as a Windwalker Monk. So with this buff you would go to about 184, 185,000 as a Windwalker, which would still be below way more specs than your power in AoE, but particularly for Mythic Plus. This is a good set of buffs. Of course, many players still lament, and now we can tie together the buff that Ret is also gaining, a 3% damage buff to all of their abilities. The lamentation of Windwalker is similar to the one of Ret, which is the fact that they have no scaling. So even if you get buffed, you still get progressively left further behind by other specs as they gain more item level, as they gain more items, more gear, more stats. They can use them, they can benefit from the stats on those pieces of gear more than Windwalker and more than Ret, who don't have nearly as much in their toolkit, something that allows them to do something more with their secondary stats. For example, if a monk crits, they do double damage. If a demon hunter crit, because they have know your enemy, not only do they do double damage, but also their crit makes them do more crit damage, and that's more scaling. So the more crit you have, the more you gain as a Havoc demon hunter, as opposed to something like a Windwalker or even a Ret paladin. That's why these type of specs are usually kind of sad when they see these type of incremental buffs throughout a patch, because these are basically band-aids. They're just temporary fixes to try to keep the spec on par with the rest, because the rest is getting stronger by itself. You have no scaling though, so the only way to get stronger by yourself is if you get a 3% buff, a 3% buff, a 5% buff that Blizzard gives you week by week, which is what basically they have been receiving this patch. The buff to Ret though, just as a side note, is a bit more relevant than the one to Windwalker, because Ret was already doing well in AoE. On top of that, Ret, as we talked about popularity, Ret is already one of the more popular melee specs at the higher level of keys. So this is not even that bad for Ret to get buffed by 3% in damage. Yes, in the raid, they are still mediocre and their single target is still weak, but in AoE they are much better off overall as a spec. After this, you also have to mention the nerf to Mistweaver, but we won't, because the nerf to Mistweaver is very, very minor. It's not even a 3, like 2.5% healing reduction to Mistweaver, which is not really going to change how powerful they are right now, in particular with their raid healing. What we can talk about though is Shadow Priest as well as Holy Priest receiving changes. You have the buff to the AoE of Shadow Priest with Psychic Link, which at this point has been changed like 6 times. This expansion started with 40%, then down to 30, then down to 25, 20, 15, and now back up to 25 again. That's not really going to fix the lack of AoE damage of Shadow Priest after the many nerfs they have received from their Exodia state, so it's a very minor band-aid. What is slightly better is the buff to Holy Priest, where they receive another stacking healing increase, 3% all healing increase plus 15% healing increase to Prayer of Mending. This is now the second type of buff that Holy Priest is receiving, and of course it is also kind of warranted given that they were lower down than the rest in terms of average. As you can see, we still have the outlier of Mistweaver in terms of pure HPS and the outlier of Holy being towards the bottom. So they have previously received a 4 to almost 5% healing increase with a buff to their tier set as well. Now another 3%. In the past couple of weeks they have basically been given a 10-ish plus % more healing, which is significant when it comes to the raid. It's obviously irrelevant when it comes to Mythic Plus. Their problems in there are with defensiveness, squishiness, staying alive, as well as with big damage windows that they cannot cover nearly as well compared to something like, for example, a Discipline Priest. But raid-wise, it's a good set of changes for Holy. Nerfs to Assassination, all ability and melee auto-attack damage reduced by 3%. Now, again, Assassination is at the top. Assassination also shows up even better than the other 2 rogue specs, because when you look at the rankings, there is something that shows up for Assassination that won't for many other specs, which is the fact that Assassination is at the moment one of the primary power infusion targets. These are the logs on Assassination, and you can see that every single slot of the buffs is being taken up by a power infusion. We can change from Gnarlroot, a meme boss, something a little bit tighter like Tindrow, and you can see that doesn't change. It's still just a whole bunch of PIs on those rogues. So these results are not actually as powerful as they look like for Assassination. These are inflated by being a PI target. You know, there are voices in the corridors that, you know, Assassination without PI stacking on fights is already an okay spec. And now a few other specs are getting buffed, like the mage specs perhaps. Assassination itself continues being nerfed. Blizzard is overlooking, for some reason, continues to overlook subtlety and outlaw. It has fixated on nerfing Assassination only. I don't know. It looks like they want to be keeping this S tier state, especially in the raid, for much longer if they continue to be focused by nerfs from Blizzard. After this, you have something that looks huge, but isn't. Elemental has earthquake damage increased by 50%, which looks massive, but it's not really that significant and impactful for AoE damage. Let's take one of the higher keys of Mythic Plus done by an Elemental Shaman. This is their damage, that's Earthquake. Great, now it's buffed by 50%. Yes, I'm being slightly disingenuous because this entire build is focused more about fire damage and lava burst damage and not actually leaning in doing more earthquake damage, right? So it could be doing more than what it's shown in here. The problem is right now that type of build is just too weak, even if you're buffing earthquake by that much. That's kind of the problem right now for Elemental. Slight buff, the only interesting thing about this buff is why wasn't it given to Elemental as well? For example, Elemental wording now reduces magic damage by an extra for enhancement, rather than for Elemental as well, considering they are just about as squishy, the both of them. That's interesting. You also have very slight changes to Resto Shaman in terms of healing, which is not really that relevant. None of this is going to amount by too much for Resto Shaman, plus their problem isn't really right now doing consistent healing, which they are already doing okay with in the raid anyways. Where we see more impactful changes are in Warlock, or possibly impactful changes. Obviously they are more AoE focused when you see the buff to Seed of Corruption, as well as Soul Rot having an extra target to be applied to. In general, Affliction, going back to our results in Mythic Plus, Affliction's damage is the lowest out of all of the DPS specs in Mythic Plus. Even if we change to look at something different, in Mythic Plus, Affliction continues to be at the very bottom in terms of damage, so this is actually not even close to being enough in terms of AoE buffs to Affliction. What is perhaps more interesting are the buffs to Destruction. Cataclysm, Rain of Fire, Immolation damage from your Infernal, as well as Immolation damage from yourself are all getting buffed. Destruction is bad, but not nearly as bad as Affliction. Destruction has a few more caveats where they can be better. They are also a possible 2-minute spec to line up with the cooldowns of an Augmentation Evoker. For example, if we imagine a world where Augmentation is the meta pick in Mythic Plus and you want to play around their Breath of Eons windows, Destruction actually also does fit well in that category. So it's in a slightly better position than Affliction, and these buffs are better and stronger than the ones that Affliction is receiving. Overall, they are decent changes to Destruction. What we can notice at the end of looking at all of these changes is that, number one, we don't have any nerfs to Beast Mastery Hunter. If we had to go back to the current results, right, we're like, okay, this has received a slap on the wrist, but no nerfs to Outlaw, no nerfs to Demo, no nerfs to Beast Mastery Hunter. If we move over to the performances of the raid, it's kind of the same. No nerf to Outlaw, no nerf to Subtlety, no nerf to Demo. So some specs are surprisingly missing, especially when it comes to the nerf. Because the buffs, we have seen actually many of them being buffed, but in terms of nerfs, if you were looking at some of the top outliers being very powerful, we have missed them. Even, you know, talking about tanks, Vengeance, besides the Sigil of Flame slight damage reduction, which is not really gonna matter too much because this is at the moment the damage done by tanks. Look at the gap of Vengeance compared to all of the other tanks. It's a 10+% more damage, of course excluding Brewmaster, as usual, having the top damage out of tanks. So those are perhaps the ones that catch the eye the most when talking about the balance tuning and the specs that have gone missing from this list. Vengeance, Beast Mastery, Demo, perhaps even Marksmanship and Survival. Because if we're talking about wanting to see BM Hunter, the overwhelmingly most popular spec in the game right now, nerfed, then that also means we want to see these two specs being buffed. For example, those also have gone missing. These are the highlights of these changes for the end of this year, because that's pretty much guaranteed. We are gonna see the next round of changes probably mid-January or something like that. So some of these are interesting, are possibly curious to see the results of these, like the buffs to Windwalker, for example. Of course, unfortunately, the buffs to all of the 3 mage specs to see the possible results. I'm gonna leave you behind with your thoughts about these changes for this incoming reset. These are not hot fixes live right now. They are coming Tuesday or Wednesday on the last reset before Christmas, I guess. So let me guys know, of course, what you think about these changes down in the comments. For now, on this Saturday, I'm going to leave you to whatever you were doing on this weekend. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which, as usual, can also be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, as we climb back down into darkness, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, as usual, the video is about 5-ish minutes longer than I wanted it to, but I can't help it. I can't help shorten it down.